that your last question?
Yes, it is. Yeah.
Thank you. Senator Ludlam.
Question.
Thank you. I've only got a couple, and sorry I missed the first part of your evidence. Can you tell us how the Paris Agreement and the agreements that Australia signed up to there specifically have changed your approach to assessing the total level and speed of pollution cuts that Australia should actually implement?
Senator, I'm sorry, I'm not quite with you. When you say speed and so on, what did you have in mind?
Well, we've been, and apologies if Senator Whish-Wilson has asked identical questions, because if he has, I'll just go to the transcript and I won't waste your time. But in previous estimate sessions, our colleague Senator Waters has asked you about the appropriate global average surface temperature limit we should be aiming at. You said 2 degrees above pre-industrial was an appropriate benchmark. It was kind of the global benchmark prior to the Paris talks. Now, the government has endorsed in the Paris Agreement has effectively enshrined an ambition to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. So that has to obviously change the nature and scale of your work.
Yeah, so look, very interesting question. I gather the actual wording of the Paris Agreement is to pursue efforts to limit the temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. The question, I think, is what does that mean for the mitigation effort? I gather that the authority looked at this a little bit in its Targets and Progress report from 2014, and one of its findings was actually that the emissions pathway to 2 degrees remains much the same until you get to mid-century, and it's at that point that you really need to ramp up effort if you're hoping to contain the rise to as we say, limit the temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. So I think just to reiterate some of the points that we discussed with your colleague Senator Whish-Wilson, the authority is still working through the scope and content of Report 3 of the Special Review, including this element of the Paris Agreement. But it's perhaps worth noting that trajectories really need, I gather, to change markedly after mid-century if the 1.5 is to be kept in prospect, because the policies to reach the 2 degrees goal allow you some flexibility around that.
Okay. Did you say that that the CCA had done some thinking along those lines in a previous document, 2014?
So there was some thinking in the Targets and Progress Review report, yes.
Okay. I guess I'm a little surprised to hear that. It sounds like a remarkably casual approach to what, on my reading, would have needed to have been much, much steeper mitigation strategies.
Well, the authority's work in Targets and Progress and in the Targets report that we produced in mid this year was, as you know, geared around the 2 degree goal and the 67% chance of reaching the 2 degree goal.
Do you work along lines of the same sort of global carbon budgets that, for example, the 350.org organisation uses, where they add up the amount of fossil fuels that are left in the world's inventories and basically sort of backcast and figure out how much has to stay in the ground?
So what the authority did was it looked at setting a global carbon budget based on, I think, 17 gigatons of CO2, and then worked out what Australia's share should be for that. And our share we assessed as 10.1, I think. And that global share was based on a modified contraction and convergence approach, which was drawn from the work that Professor Garneau did some years ago.
So some countries get to go up a little bit, but industrialised heavy emitters have to go down fairly steeply.
Within that's right. So basically you converge on per capita, but you allow some flexibility for the developing countries, right, recognising that their need for development might require their emissions to go up in the sort of short to medium term. Yeah.
So on our admittedly total back of the envelope calculations, the 1.5 degree thing completely blows those budgets out of the water, and you actually need very, very steep energy descent, effectively.
So Senator, we'd be very happy to go back to targets and progress and provide on notice some of the material in that report if that would assist.
Well, I can find the 2014 work. I suppose I'm more interested in what you might be doing in 2016. Do you want to sketch that out for us a bit?
So as I said earlier, Senator, the authority is probably more at the beginning than the end of looking at what it will put in the third report of the special review, which is looking at the Paris outcomes. So I can't really, unfortunately, give you much detail on their thinking on all of that at this point in time.
When would you expect to publish that document, though?
Well, the terms of reference require us to publish it by the 30th of June this year.
Great. 30 June. Okay. Yep. Have you made, this is my last one, have you made an assessment, or do you think it's part of your remit to make an assessment of where the world is heading post the Paris Agreement? Do you think, for example, that the approach that the world is taking is still consistent with the UNEP's estimate of 3 to 4 degrees, which is what they predicted prior to the Paris talks having taken place on the basis of commitments that had been made to date? Climate Action Tracker estimated we were headed for 2.7 degrees. Where does the CCA think the world is headed on the basis of the actual commitments that have been made?
So I think the Climate Action Tracker is 2.6 to 3.7. So is that? Just on page 3. Thank you. 2.7 to 3.6, and the reason they identified a range was because while I think nearly 190 or 100 or so 190 odd countries had put forward internationally determined contributions, not all of them have outlined the policies they'll put in place to meet those goals. So that was why there was that range.
So I can
but Senator, if I could just
uncertainty.
circle back to your question,
Yeah.
and sorry for interrupting you. I think most people would acknowledge that, and indeed most commentators acknowledge that Paris on its own isn't going to reach the 2 degrees, which is why, or the even the 1.5, which is why the global stock take, which is part of the Paris outcome that will occur in 2018, and the 5-year review requirements for individual countries is so important, because that's the mechanism by which I think people are hoping that global emissions reductions will be able to get to well below the 2 degree goal.
So just finally, and with the indulgence of the Chair, what institutional linkages are there behind the scenes? So for example, the Queensland Labor government has just signed off on one of the largest coal mines in the world, in the Galilee Basin. What institutional linkages exist that we might not be able to see in public between your work that says some of this stuff has to stop happening and actual decisions that are happening on the ground while you're doing this research? Because it seems to us that you can write all the reports that you like, but if governments are going to continue to open up fossil fuel extraction projects on the scale, then you might as well not bother. So how does your advice get into the hands of people who are in charge of signing off projects?
Well, Senator, it's again a very interesting one. The authority has been asked to do the special review, of which we are now 2/3 of the way through. We provide our advice to government, and then government makes its decisions on the back of our advice. That said, though, our reports go into the public domain. The research that we do that underpins them also go into the public domain, and I think they help inform the policy discussion around all of these things, and hopefully have some influence. Certainly,
It doesn't sound like a very strong linkage. We hope that the Queensland Labor government reads the reports, but there's no process. You don't go around and brief them, for example.
I've been quite indulgent with your last question, and
lucky
now
that
you're
it's
actually
such
providing
important
some
stuff.
editorial comment to your question.
I think the
So-
answer is reasonably clear.
Okay.
You
Senator,
publish and you hope they read.
In fact, we do make efforts to talk to a number of people, stakeholders with an interest in our work, and from time to time we do brief state governments on various elements of our work. We did go and meet with some officials from the Queensland Government. I think it was in September or October last year.
Okay.
So we do try and ensure that those conversations and dialogue happen.
Great. Might be time for another call. Thanks, Chair.